Hey gamers, welcome to another episode of RPGaymer podcast. Today we're joined by the highly successful indie RPG creator of Crystal Project, the River Runner himself. Andrew Willman is here. My friend, thank you so much for
Hey,
joining us today.
hi, thanks. I'm really happy to be here and talk about this. It's
Yeah,
exciting.
it was so great to have you a part of our book group on your game. I know our community super enjoyed the time with you there, and I feel like you had a good time too, right?
Yeah, definitely. It was really fun hearing people talk about the game in over voice because I'd only really heard feedback from strangers through Discord or Reddit. So yeah, that was interesting.
It is weird when you throw the humanity back into it because I feel
Yeah.
like it's so people can be artistic in the way they say things, people can be really like blunt and rude in the way they say things, but when you put like the face and the humanity to it, I feel like it just kind of makes it a lot more special.
Yep.
Well, as we usually do in our podcast, just to, like warm things up and get things going, I thought it'd be fun to do a little icebreaker question. So I think it'd be fun just to ask, especially relating to your game, if you had to pick the one class in an RPG to be, what would that class be? And we'll start with you, Andrew, and then we'll go around. But what class would you be if you had to be one?
I'd probably pick the Blue Mage archetype because I like the jack of all trades thing, but I've always really liked, okay, in real life
Are you my
learning things.
soulmate? Like,
Same.
Maybe, yeah. I guess in real life I don't learn things from monsters, but I mean, yeah,
Is your
it's
real name Patrick?
Yeah, are you also a Patrick? Is
three
this
Patricks.
yeah.
Yeah.
I that excellent choice. Like for me, it's actually the same. Blue mage, red mage. I like kind of the jack of all tradiness of the approach of life of just kind of like dabbling your feet in everything. But also, I just love those classes in games because I feel like it's one thing to nail something like really really hard, but it's better I think to have like those classes that can fill that role. What about you, Soup?
Literally Blue Mage also. In
Wow.
comparison to my life,
And like
it's
going to
like
collect things too. That's a part of it
Oh,
that
it's so
exactly.
much it's
Yeah.
so much fun. Absolutely.
Love little trinkets in real life, love getting new spells in games,
I
collecting new hobbies.
I feel like the more I get to know you, like the cooler and cooler you become. So that is just
Yeah.
so awesome. And that's actually what we're gonna do here today on the podcast. We're gonna go ahead and like talk to Andrew about just kind of like life stuff and who you are and what got you to creating Crystal Project. And then we're gonna, in our second half of our episode, really dig into Crystal Project itself. So let's start. And I kind of want to know, and I feel like this is a question we talked about in our Discord, but I want to hear maybe even a little bit more. But what were some of your favorite games as a kid?
Yeah, I think okay, when I was really young, my favorite game was Mega Man, and like each one that came out, they came out really fast, like every year. And
They
that was
really
the
did.
yeah, and in hindsight, that's pretty impressive. That doesn't really happen anymore. But it was great because every year it was the thing I'd look for under the Christmas tree, and I really liked it. But then as I got older, I guess I discovered Final Fantasy 3/6, and like that was my first look into what a video game could be with how big the scale was, like the whole world, the characters and the story and everything, and that's where I fell in love with that kind of game.
What
And
was it
then
about the Blue Bomber that pulled you in?
I don't really know. It might have just been my first exposure to a video game.
Sure.
I can't really remember, but maybe collecting the abilities from bosses and wondering what they
Blue
would do.
Mage.
Blue Mage. Yeah.
Mage.
Mega Man is kind of a blue mage.
Truly.
True.
Yeah, he is blue. But yeah, then after FF3, I just loved RPGs for those same reasons, like how big they were and exploring the worlds and stuff. Yeah.
What is it aside from exploring the worlds that pulls you into RPG? I know, like Brian, you're a huge RPGer. You've like an RPGer for life, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
And what?
Like I'm huge into mechanics, finding out the weird stuff that like the game doesn't tell you, or just like reading item descriptions to like build off of that. Like that's what really pulls me in.
That's actually really awesome. It's something I would want to say about this is because something that's really neat about RPGs, and it's kind of unique to RPGs, is that how it draws in lots of different people for different reasons. Like,
Hmm.
people that love story are going to be drawn to them, and people that love strategy and mechanics will be drawn to them, and people that love exploring will be drawn to them. And they're all like different kinds of gamers, but we all love the same game. That's neat. I don't
Exactly.
think there's
Yeah.
other genres that really pull people together like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, the thing I like about them is this third one, exploring, as you might have guessed from the game I made. But like
Yeah.
wondering what will I find as you go through it, and like how big the worlds are could be anything, especially when you're younger and you haven't experienced a bunch of games yet. It's like, because even then, if you play the most linear RPG that isn't really about exploring and everything's still new to you and you haven't seen many games, you're still discovering stuff and you don't know what will happen. But I guess as you get older and you play more, you start to see patterns, and like that kind of shifts your point of view, and like the magic fades as the curtains open a little, but like there's still games that are really about exploring, and like I still absolutely love those ones. Yeah.
I think that's just such a great frame on how to get enjoyment out of RPGs, or like what you look for in them. I can definitely relate to that. I'm playing Final Fantasy Renaissance right now for the second or third time. Are you familiar with that?
I can't remember which one that is. Is it one that like mixes different Final Fantasies?
So
Am
it
I thinking of the right one?
like it's a rebuild of Final Fantasy 1. Like someone completely rebuilt it from the
Oh,
ground
oh, I know
up.
what it is. It's the one where they add like new classes
Yeah,
and
and they added
things.
a bunch of
Okay.
new classes and things, and like what some of the new classes add, like abilities to breathe fresh life into the game that I specifically know because Final Fantasy was the first RPG I ever played, Final Fantasy One, and just like different ways to go in. Like if you have the summoner, you can go into these like the upside down in some of the areas and unlock summons. Or if you have a thief, you are often like doing a hot and cold game in some of the areas that you know where like this is normally a dead end, but there's a secret item here. And you take that all the way to new games where you're playing something like Dragon's Dogma 2, where sometimes, yeah, you have the quests to have a big payload, but sometimes it's about like, I want to walk up on that hill and see what's on that hill, and there is this hidden treasure that like is not marked, it just happens to be there, it's my little secret. And I feel like that's the beauty of RPGs that you don't get in a lot of games, just kind of like reflecting what you guys are saying, because I completely agree, there's just something so fulfilling about the little things that you find.
Yeah, and then even someone that just likes mechanics will enjoy exploring that hill because they'll find a neat mechanic thing. But then someone that likes exploring will be like, well, I found this neat place and it actually has a reward. Yeah.
And that's honestly how you get like a lot of rare items that aren't in shops too, is continuing to explore.
I think I said this in one of our pre-meetings, Andrew, and also like in the book group. But one of the things I just love about Crystal Project so much is just how typically what you're finding as you're exploring in your game isn't what you can buy. And like we can definitely talk about that later. But you really like nail that, like why exploring is fun. But before we get there, we'll pin that thought. I guess I want to dial back a little bit more. I know I poked you about this a little bit, but like I'm personally on my own game deving journey, but you've been doing this for quite some time, and I was wondering if you were willing to share what that journey looked like for you. Like what got you started, where were you in your life, and then how has it kind of evolved over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't really focus on doing this for real like until university, but when I reflect on my life, it sort of felt like it was my calling forever, because back when I liked Mega Man, sometimes if I, wasn't allowed to play or wasn't playing, I'd cut out like snippets of paper and build levels on the floor and stuff.
Love
So
that.
like definitely remember doing that. But then as I grew older, I remember saying that like the more you play games, the more you sort of see patterns, and it's can become harder to own in and find those like the ones that fit your taste specifically. And so when that was happening to me, maybe like around high school, it was natural to fall into a like state of mind where I'm brainstorming, if I made a game that like would fit this criteria that I like, what would that look like? And it's just fun to think about. And then the first time I actually tried to do it would be with the Blizzard editors, which are really good. I think I started with StarCraft, and then the Warcraft 3 one was like way better than that. But I used both, and so that sort of got me into the world of doing game dev. Like, oh, this is real, and you can do lots of neat things. And I think I always wanted to make an RPG. So then the next natural step was using RPG Maker. And then that was fun because I just start using the UI and stuff, and then I discovered like that the scripting editor, and it just has all the code for the game. The one I was using was XP or MV. I can't remember, but it was coded in Ruby, and like it was all there. And that's kind of where I started to learn how to code, just reading that and understanding it and how to make changes there that I wanted to see in the game. And it's sort of funny because now that I talk about it, a lot of the ways that I like architect the game from a coding point of view are still like things I learned from how RPG Maker's scripts were put together. But yeah,
it's almost like you're talking about the patterns that appear in video games, but I think you're also noticing like the patterns across coding platforms there too.
Specifically coding is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like how the way like I separate the title screen from the field from the battle is like I still use the same pattern for doing that as was in the scripting system there, like changed a bit over the years, but still. But then after RPG Maker and learning to code through that, I started trying out actual coding to see what that would be like. And I think I started with C++, and OpenGL at the time. There wasn't a lot of options then. And like that was kind of diving into the deep end a little bit. And I struggled with some stuff there, and some things about that language were kind of frustrating. I don't know if
what are the hurdles for coding in that, because I think it's as important too. I think a lot of people get a lot of different things when they listen to our podcast. Sometimes I like hearing people's opinions on games that relate to mine or differing opinions, but especially after having Tim Kane on and thinking of his audience, I know he got a lot of appreciation out of the people who wanted to learn the craft. So I think you talking about those things is actually great. I don't think it's boring at all, because it kind of gives everybody, it's kind of like the jack of all trades of topics, right? Like you're giving it something for a little bit of everyone.
Yeah, and that's another reason I like game dev, as another side rant, is how it brings together music, art, gameplay, coding. It's just really cool. I don't think there's any other field that does that with so many different things. But to get into the coding, so when people hear about C++, the thing that's scary about it is memory management. I don't really struggle with that, probably because I started in C++ or C, kind of a hybrid of both. The thing that annoyed me was the headers, and being careful not to include multiple headers by mistake, and that all became a mess. And then when you're running the game and you get an error, typically at least back then, I haven't worked in it in a long time, but the error you'd get when you're running would be so disconnected from what actually happened, where it would take so much effort to debug it. And so, I still made a silly little game using OpenGL and C, but then when Microsoft made XNA and released that, and they were pushing it to universities and stuff to code games in C#, I tried that. And it just felt so much more comfortable because it fixed both those problems. And that's kind of where I settled. I think if I went back to do C++ now, I probably wouldn't struggle with those things as much. But
I'm kind of curious, yeah. What was your little beta game like?
It was like, I don't know how to describe it. I should find screenshots of it because I can hardly remember. It had a world map. And I remember the music I used for it was an OC remix of Terra's theme from FF3.
So yeah.
Super techno-y.
I think we're both familiar with that.
Yeah. And you walked around the world map a bit, and you went into a town. The world map had kind of 3D mountains and stuff, but then the towns were just 2D flat sprites, and it was really ugly because the sprites didn't like connect. It was like grass tile, then tree, tree. But it was something, and it was fun to make. And you left the town, you went into a cave. It was pretty small, but yeah,
I hear that's the big advice for everyone is to when you're getting into this, even if whether you're zero knowledge or you're coming in with like a pretty good coding background, is just to start small. Like I think it's great to be ambitious, but like I think if you come in and you're like, I'm gonna do all these things, you're gonna be super humbled when it actually comes to doing them or realizing how many people you might need to do that dream, right?
It's definitely good advice, and it's hard to follow because we all want to get into game dev to make our, like, the grand idea that we're excited about. And it's difficult to say, no, I have to work on this smaller thing because, like, you need to kind of learn. Well, first of all, the thing that you make initially will be, like, you'll be learning, so the way it's built won't be, like, very scalable. I don't know how to explain, but, like, as you're learning and you're building something, it becomes harder and harder to add to it because it's like very messy. And so you do that once as like a trial run to see how you build something, and then you learn like, oh, if I did this thing differently, like it'd be much easier to scale up and add more like areas or enemies and things. And so, yeah, you definitely want to start small as you begin, but it's also important to start with something you're excited about. So finding a genuinely good project you want to work on, but trying your best to make it small, like that's probably the best idea.
Going off of that, like, was it from that game that like you knew especially that's what you wanted your focus on life to be?
That's a good question, and I think I didn't know that I wanted my life to be about coding or even game dev until university. Up until then, I thought I was going to be a teacher because both my parents are teachers. So I sort of had that in the back of my mind while growing up. And like, as I was going through school, I had a lot of trouble kind of understanding and learning things. But then when I would get it, talking about like very basic geometry and stuff that like you learn in grade school or middle school, but then when I did get it and it clicked, I thought, oh, if only they said this, I would have got it right away. I have to be a teacher and like collect all these little nuggets and just tell them, and I'll be the best teacher in the world. But then I didn't realize until way later that everybody learns differently, obviously. And so like the ways, those little things that worked for me wouldn't make any sense to other people. So I would have been a really bad teacher. It's probably good that I didn't get into that. But then I switched to coding. Like, I made it to the last year of high school, applied for universities, and got accepted for doing teaching. And then I made a super last minute decision to switch to coding because that's when I did that switch from Blizzard editors and RPG makers to doing actual code. And then I was so interested in it that I just like flipped what I was doing and took another year to pick up the maths I needed and stuff for a comp sci degree.
Were they still doing OACs in Canada at that point, or was OAC gone? Because I know my brother had to do it.
What's OAC again? I don't think
grade 13. Because like, well, people don't realize this, but like Canada literally
like the double cohort thing.
Yeah, it would make you go to pretty much grade 13 if you were college bound. I remember my brother was maybe one of the last years that had to do it, and they had like a few optional transitional years if you wanted to do it. But I wasn't sure if that's what you were doing.
No,
here.
It's the same here. My brother, who's older than me, was the last OAC year. So then my final year of high school was grade 12.
Are you me in a different universe? Because like wanted to be a teacher, but like one of us got into gaming and the other one didn't. I was a teacher. Our brothers are probably the same age. We're the same age. We both want to be blue mages. I think we might be the same person. I think you might be like the fork in the road.
Especially that blue mage thing. That's how you can really tell.
Yeah, truly. Yeah. Pivotal.
But like because of the OAC, that's interestingly like another reason I stayed, because I'm like, well, my brother took another year, like who cares? Whereas if that didn't happen, maybe it would have been a little more weird. So in a way, I'm thankful for that.
It's definitely not as like shameful in Canada as it is in the US. I feel like if you were like, hey, you're gonna stay another year of school in the US, like the students would murder you. Like they would.
Yeah.
We call it super seniors.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but typically like super seniors aren't people who choose to stay. They're obligated to stay.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
in Canada, it's like, do you want to stay for an extra year? And typically it was because you were going to college. You know what I mean? It wasn't even like a punishment, you know what I mean, or punitive in any way. It's weird. Canada, it's fun. Well, I kind of piggybacking off of that and jumping into what Soup was saying, like, how did you know this is what you wanted to focus in your life? What kinds of things did you do that kept you dedicated to the project? Because I'm sure with something where you're setting your own goals and deadlines and being like the sole creator, that is probably really hard. So like, what kinds of things were you doing to keep yourself motivated, on task, convince yourself I'm doing the right thing?
Well, it's because the whole reason I made the game was just really for fun. It wasn't for releasing and selling, really.
Passion project, right?
Yeah, and like in that sense, it's really hard to stay motivated because as the longer you work on a project for, the harder it is to stay motivated because like that last home stretch is really, it's like the last 20% is 80% of the work, and that phrase is, I'm sure you've heard it before. There's lots of different ways to put it, and creatively it's difficult because when you start a project, you're coming up with ideas constantly about possibilities and like, oh, I could put this here, that there, this class, and they would work this way. And it's just really fun. But as you get to the end, you're doing the opposite. The ideas you come up with have to be about narrowing it down, which isn't nearly as fun. But it's necessary. You can't just, otherwise it would just keep expanding and you'd never finish.
Mm-hmm.
But because I was doing it for fun, the key thing to stay motivated was to try my best to keep making it fun. And that dawned on me one day when I was playing Super Mario Maker. And I was like, why am I doing this when I have an actual game to make over there? And it's because the game is fun. The tools are good to use. They are tools.
Yeah, they gamified it, right? Like, if you can gamify anything, it's an instant success.
So I spent a long time after that point trying to make the tools for making my game a lot more fun to use. They're not Mario Maker level by any means, but like when you have an idea for how to build like a new biome or zone or something, it was just good enough that I could go in and kind of paint it and feel it out, like instantly drop into the level, walk around, see how it is, and like if there's one little block I don't like, it's really easy to put a new one and just see how that feels. Just like removing friction, making it fun to iterate. Like that's really important. And if someone is struggling to finish their project, that's like the number one piece of advice I'd give them.
So
like really
find
focus
the
on
fun
your tools
and the
to
tools.
be
Okay,
fun to use.
that's incredible.
That's really good advice.
That's great advice, and that applies everywhere. You know what I mean? Like I think if you're writing a novel, I think if you're a poet, I think if you are a designer, I think that advice really, it's universal. So that's awesome. Well, let's say we move on over to Crystal Project. First of all, thank you for sharing all those things about your life. I think like it's just great for I think we're in the era of when content creators have the ability and are more open to sharing bits of their life, almost in like a paying it forward sense, where it's not, you're not doing it in a boasting sense, you're doing it because you want to like A, reflect on yourself, like, oh yeah, I did this and I got here, but B, like you think of all the people that you inspire by like doing what you did and then talking about it. I think it's great, so thank you.
No, it's really fun to be here. I appreciate being invited.
Of course. And now we're going to move on to Crystal Project. I thought it'd be really fun. Let's start out with just something as simple as, how did you decide on the name Crystal Project? Is it as blatant, as obvious as we think it is, or is there something more to it there?
It's probably as obvious as you think it is. It's kind of the perfect title for the game, I think, because the game is about collecting crystals, so it's gameplay related. The story is about a project to do with crystals, so it fits there. And then it's my project about making a game to do with crystals. And it's also a bit weird and intriguing. Like if you compare it to a name like Crystal Adventure or Crystal Quest or something, it doesn't have the same like I don't know, it's a bit odd.
Yeah, I
And I
feel like
think that's
one word's very like whimsical and fun, and the other word is
Mhm.
like very like solid. Where if you're throwing two of those really whimsical words together, like you're saying like Crystal Adventure, it
Yeah.
blends, right? It kind of like sounds like
Yeah.
a lot of different games. So B like there's almost like this cool. It's like this really cool juxtaposition to it.
Yeah.
It almost
It's
makes it sound like it would be a like more of an 8-bit adventure game, like for like the Game Boy or like the original Nintendo.
yeah, definitely. It has that sort of like essence to it. That yeah, it makes a lot
Yeah.
of sense.
In making this game, like what was like the ultimate goal that you wanted when you created it?
It was really just to like have fun, honestly. And
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't have it's it's weird because I think a lot of people's game ideas are like there's a grand thing, a vision in their mind, and they want to put that they want to make that real. But
Yeah.
this game was weird to make because it was really like just start working and see where it goes kind of thing.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And because then like when I start working on it, that was one of the things that made it more fun. If you have like a blueprint in your mind and you want to create that, it's kind of becomes work to translate that blueprint onto the computer.
Yeah.
Because then you're just like being like, okay, we're going through my list and we're going to tackle this chunk today. But I tried to, and I did this on purpose when I was coming up with how the game would be. It would be like when I start working on it, I could say, well, I'm going to start making an area over here and kind of see what happens with it. And it just became more exploratory and fun.
Yeah.
And
It reminds me a lot of like making a D&D campaign.
yeah, that's a good point. Like you just sort of build outwards as you go. And that's part of what makes it fun and interesting. Yeah.
I
Did you
love that, and I love how like talking about your goal and whatnot. Also curious, because Crystal Project has a really interesting structure for its narrative, where like it's light on the narrative, but it also has these like deep philosophical quotes. What was your goal, or like what did you intend for the player to experience as they're playing this game, kind of with that in mind?
Well, that's interesting because like the reason I did that is I realized I was just bad at writing. And that's how it is.
That's
I
so
won't be able to, right? It's like the one of the initial ideas I had for wanting for an RPG and like when I wanted to make one is a big epic story with like set pieces and like moments that send shivers down your spine. You're like, wow, that was cool. I wanted to build that too, but I realized I couldn't. And if I tried to, it would just fall flat. And like, this was one of the turning points where I finally was able to start working on this game for real and eventually finish it is when I realized like, no, I have to focus on my strengths and avoid the things I'm not good at and like embrace that. And so that's why the game has no story, but that also like makes it what it is. I think if it had a story, it couldn't work the same way. And
Mhm.
like so it was something that came out of a limitation that I put on myself. I'm like, how can I make an RPG interesting in spite of the fact that I can't write? And like it still needs something, right? Like you can't just be gameplay in a world and you play and you go. There has to be something there. There has to be lore or mystery to draw you in. And that's really important, but that is different from writing. Like I can't make arguments and conversations and banter, but I can make a world that has interesting things in it, and as you play you uncover them and that draws you forward. And
That's a really good thought. Like, not all world building is characterization or dialogue. You know, there is
Yeah.
so much more to world building than those things. Like you said, you have the lore, you have the intentional design, you have these like beautiful quotes about adventure, and just kind of like what you get out of the thrill of adventure. I think those are all great aspects to like that kind of
Yeah.
development in your style.
Hmm.
And so there is writing in it, right? Like
Hmm.
I had to, and all the writing there took like way more effort than it might have looked like. But there is a bit, like the quotes, and there are some conversations. So like even that is still kind of important. But like
Yeah.
one of my favorite things, uh, hearing people talk about after they play the game is like their theories of what's actually happening. And that's really neat. You can't get that unless you have lore and mystery and stuff. And like for all those things, there are canonical, concrete explanations and answers, but they're sort of deliberately not said explicitly. Everything's there for you to kind of become able to kind of like come up with the right things, but it's never said. And I think that was a good idea because, well, it's been really fun for me to see people come up with ideas, but like it's neat to be able to interpret something to in your own way also, I think.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, normally this would be where I'd ask for you to spill some tea, but I think
Yeah.
honestly it might be better to, like, not dig and let the mystery continue.
Yeah. I
I
will
know we
say that
had
people
some
have
Discord
figured
members.
it out. I'll, like,
Oh, they have?
yeah.
That's actually good to know, and I'm happy that you can confirm that too, because I really hate it when some not content creators, but maybe like novelists are a little bit more pretentious in their
They'll
design.
never
And
tell.
they'll
Yeah.
never tell. It's good that you're like, yeah, some people like know what's going on here, so
Mhm.
that's good.
I know we had some members in the Discord that had like theories of like where all the Nans came from, or like they thought that there was like a grander scheme to them.
I mean, there
That's a
are
good
answers
answer.
for where they came
Yeah.
from. Something I'll
Yeah.
add to that, which is nice, is like some ideas people have come up with are like better and more interesting than what I had in my mind for them.
Hmm.
I'm not saying anything about that one, but yeah, that is something too, right? It's neat.
Yeah.
Well, let's dig back into design a little bit more here too, and like thinking of the fun environments to explore when you're traipsing across, you know, the Arctic area in Crystal Project or the desert. What goes into designing a world when you have to factor in the caves, the biomes, and even the puzzles?
It's hard. It's and like so earlier I was talking about how I would just sort of jump in and start like painting a new area. In reality, like there's a bit more to it than that because you do have to plan ahead about how things are going to be laid out. And like I think there's probably three layers to it. One is the overall layout of the world. Like you want the capital city kind of central to stuff. Otherwise, like if it's over here, you're always traveling this way to get to stuff, and
Right.
it's kind of boring or too time consuming. So like the layout of where that is, fast travel points and everything is important. But then you have to consider the progression order. And that's like when you get to the capital, you go to the Quintar field, then you go to the nest, and then you go back to the Quintar field on like the higher layer, then you go to the sanctum, and like that's a progression order where you draw it on a line when you're playing it out. But then the layout is like you have the capital, then underneath you have the sewer, and then that's next to the nest. Like they're kind of separate things to consider, but you
Mhm.
have to think about both of them. And then the third one is when you're designing a zone, you have to think about the navigation there specifically. Like, what will be interesting about how you travel around it? Like, everything should have a different feel.
Mhm.
Like, there's some places with lots of verticality and bridges, others that is mostly flat plains where you're focusing more on like dodging encounters. And just like switching it up is important. Some places have moving platforms, and like some places are vertical cliffs. Just kind of always keeping it fresh.
I know our Discord members would completely not agree with the sentiment I'm about to give, but I love the platforming heavier areas. I know they're very appreciative on what you included recently in terms of platforming with like the auto jump stuff, but the two waterfall areas I kind of love because sometimes you get tired of like just linear flat or even open flat areas to explore, but there's something really cool about this area that you're like winding your way up. I feel like it has a really big payoff and adds some really good like ways to maneuver the encounters up there. So those are some of my favorite parts with the little more platform vertical heavy.
I'm glad you like that. Yeah. Like, honestly, I think the most important thing is just always keeping it a bit different.
Like the variety.
Yeah, like variety is really, really critical, in my opinion. Anyway.
Yeah. It reminded me a lot of like Metroidvanias.
Yeah.
Because you did have to get something first, like the mounts, before you went back to like a certain area. So I loved that feature a lot.
I think you did. It was really great to like, and you were great about dropping hints like with I think all of the mounts, you know, you'd see the Ibex and then you'd know that like I need to come back here later, or you'd see the owl and know that like, oh, it flew north, you know, like maybe I should fly my bird north when I get here. I just love those like little like, you're not telling this is where you need to go, but you are also telling like this is kind of where you should go next. I thought that was really fun.
Like, that was something I didn't really come up with on my own. I sort of learned it by playing more Metroidvanias. Like, I played Super Metroid really late in my life, and while I was working on this game. And I learned things like that from that game, where early on in Crystal Project's development, those hints weren't really there, and so it was kind of like... It doesn't work as well if you get a mount and you're like, I'm just gonna go randomly wander around. But if you make areas in a way where like it has something memorable about a specific spot where like it stays in your mind, and then when you get the mount you're like, oh, I can go back to this spot. And, like it's way more interesting, and in hindsight it's obvious. But yeah, it's I'm glad you like that. It was a big thing to realize that improved the game a lot.
Well,
this game had a lot of influences from games that I thought other JRPGs should have had influences from, like MMOs. Besides like the threat system, like what were like other things that you wanted to put in the game from other genres?
I think I had the same like thought as you, really, like being motivated from other games and thinking, why aren't these mechanics in RPGs, really? Honestly, I'm surprised a threat system like Crystal Projects isn't already in a Final Fantasy or something. It's sort of weird. Like, it feels like it fits very well. Like, surely my game's not the first one to do that, but I think it might be, which is odd.
I think it is.
I will say, like, when we talked about this, I know Soup and I have talked about this just in terms of your game, even before we got you officially on. You're playing something like Final Fantasy V, and the only way, if you have the Knight class, to cover your other party members is if their hit points are low or you're using cover. So you actively have to guard. But, you know, in your class, it just kind of flips it, or your game flips it completely, because, you know, like, there are passive ways and active ways to make the tank do its job. And it just like, why would you ever want to use a tank class in some of those Final Fantasy games when they don't get to do that? And even thinking of things like Fire Emblem, some of the games where it's coded in that if an enemy unit knows that it can't do any damage to your tank, even if the tank is the only person in range, they won't proc the attack. So it's like, it's almost like, why have a tank? Like, it's almost better to have someone who can dodge or like take some damage. So like, I just think it's great. Like, I think that's a great mechanic, and like, you're right, why don't we see that in more games?
Yeah, it is interesting. It almost feels like if a game relies too much on randomness, and like threat is a way to take away randomness and make it deterministic. And if it's random, it's like, is that what makes it hard? And if so, can that be frustrating? Because then you can just try a fight over and over again until things work out the way you want. But having all these deterministic mechanics, like, the threat, and then there's the turn order that you can view, and then calculations when you're about to attack. And you know all these things, and if you have no randomness, how do you make that hard? And it's, well, you turn it into a puzzle, and like that's kind of interesting. I mean, you can still have randomness, but if you don't rely on it for the game to be hard, it's, I don't know, it's different, I guess. A lot of tactical RPGs already do that, but it isn't generally found in turn-based party ones.
I feel like that just encourages a lot of like of those previous games to just like make you focus on building a high damage build almost every single time, because it always prevails.
Yeah, and even my game does, well, I want to say suffer from that a bit, but it's
Assassin
kind
Hunter.
of it's like having overpowered things like that is good, because you want people to be able to discover them and feel good about having found them, and like that's really fun.
I will say too, like in the nature of how you design and the variety, having the overpowered builds doesn't carry the entire experience, where like, you know, Assassin Hunter might work super well in like the Colosseum, but it's not going to carry you through the super bosses. You know, anything that has like a certain hit point threshold, it's not going to get to do the job that it does. So I think there's like some grace in that, where you think of other games where it's like, this is what my character is going to do from the beginning to the end of the game, and there's no variety to it. Like are you familiar with Etrian Odyssey? Have you played?
I haven't, but I want to. I have them, and I'm like ready to jump in. Actually, I'd be curious to hear about which one to start with, but you can finish your thought first.
Start with four. It was like
write that down.
The reboot on it. I wouldn't say start with 1, 2, or 3, just because I think they're a little bit more brutal. But 4 was like the great entryway for a lot of people because it was on the 3DS. But the one thing about those games, sometimes it feels like once you're set, and you're not varying what you do. It's kind of the same flow. But I feel like the nice thing about Crystal Project is like I was often varying my weapons, my passive skills, my classes, because like it never felt like the one thing was working all the time. And that might sound frustrating to people that just kind of want to pound through, but I think like tactical brain side, I actually love that, because it's like you're saying, battle is a puzzle. What do I need to change in order to do this puzzle, as opposed to like the numbers are big so I win, because that's never really fun, right?
But you're right, because so going through the game, and if you reach a roadblock and you have to switch things up, that can feel frustrating, because you built a team that you like and you want to be able to use it. And I think the farther you get into the game, the more this happens, especially with like those last late game puzzle bosses. But something that I tried to do early game is, usually when you find a class, somewhere nearby there'll be a weapon or something that fits really well with that class, which means, oh, well, the best thing to do is switch to that and use it, and that's now your strongest option. And that sort of like makes you want to experiment in a bit, because it's optimal, and then you learn that and you become comfortable with that class, and then it continues, hopefully, throughout the game. I don't know if every case worked out that way.
But I think that's good intended design too, and I think that's kind of what I want to talk about next, because one of my favorite things about a game, and just specifically in terms of equipment, is when equipment feels more lateral than this weapon is better than this weapon is better than this weapon, because you're thinking of like different builds and approaches. It's really cool when, you know, in the same area you're getting, well, this sword increases my defense, but this one gives me 50% lifesteal, but this one has the ice element, but this one adds more threat to me, and they're all about the same attack, as opposed to this one's better and this one's better. And I think that makes it fun, because you get to play with builds a lot more. But why did you decide to include that system? Because I have my like qualms with the former, but I'm curious about like what was it that inspired you to be like equipment should be a little bit more universal and applied to the build?
I think just making choices is fun. Is really the gist of it. Not permanent choices; those can be annoying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like a lot of RPGs make it so when you get to a town, you can just buy everything and you upgrade. That feels good in the sense that you get to a new place and now you're stronger across the board. But I think it's also interesting if you get to a new place and you're like, oh, well, I have to pick between these different ways to improve my build. The mechanics, like you said, like lifesteal or more damage, or. But then you also have to pick. You don't have enough money to buy everything, so it's like, well,
Ever.
do I need more armor?
Ever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's you really never have enough money because not only do you have to decide between equipment, but then you also need to decide whether you want to spend money on maps and other things, and it's like a different layer of choice too, because if you buy the maps, then you'll be better at exploring to find equipment in that way, hopefully. It's just neat to make choices. And like
Makes you care way more about your characters.
yeah, and if you something about that I think isn't good is you get a bit of decision paralysis, and then you're worried like, oh well, if I buy the wrong stuff and I decide later I instead want these other things, it's hard to undo that, and that's a downside. But then the further you get into the game, your gold gain exponentially increases. So like after you do a couple more areas, you'll be able to afford everything in that last town. But that it doesn't come across that way always. But
I kind of think it's fun in the sense too where there were times where earlier equipment felt more applicable than newer equipment, like thinking of the sword that cuts your Reaver's hit points in half, but also like gives it, was it 100% life drain at that point too? So you know you have a penalty, but you also have a huge boon, especially if you can keep them alive for a couple rounds, because their max HP just keeps on growing and growing. And I just think that's so cool to think about, that like, wow, I there are so many different ways that you can strategize a character in a build, where it's, I feel like a lot of games it's like it's where you're investing your skill points because the equipment just comes naturally, but like here it truly is like a little bit of everything.
yeah, making it so that early game equipment is still valuable later. It's almost impossible, but I tried really hard to do that by giving earlier stuff really neat mods and trying to balance it that way. Um, yeah, if I were to do it again, I'd probably try and find a way to upgrade that older stuff or just put that on newer things. But it's also neat if someone comes up with the idea that's sort of out of the box to use an older piece of equipment because it's actually the best thing for that time. Like that's really cool too. So I'm not sure. It's fun to balance stuff like that. It's like when I was talking about how when I was building this game, it's always like in the back of my mind and coming up with ideas. Like thinking about balancing that sort of stuff is one of the most fun things, and in like writing down notes all the time, and yeah, it's interesting.
That also reminds me of a lot of like MMO, like how you can just make your build off of older weapons still, and they're always relevant.
Yeah.
So yeah, what goes into your class design, and like what kind of approaches did you use to balance that? What were like some of your favorites, and like did that, working on those classes, did that make you change other classes?
This is a heavy hitting question because I have a lot to say about it and balancing, because it's so fun. I have a lot of fun doing it, and like, and it's partly to do with the games I've been influenced by growing up, right? Like something. Okay, so this is kind of a tangent, but back when I really liked Diablo 2. Did you guys play it?
Oh yeah.
I'm sure like many people of our generation got deeply into it and like traded items at high school and stuff. But like was really addicted to it and liked it. But one thing I liked that it did is how it made physical classes feel different from magical classes at like a mechanical level.
Hmm.
Because physical classes were very gear dependent and magical classes weren't really. And it's because damage for physical classes came from your weapon, but then magic classes it came from your spells. And that's interesting. Because like you could start as a mage to kind of get through the game and collect stuff and then transfer it over to a barbarian. It's just neat. It has personality. And when Diablo 3 came out, something it did was like every class just had to collect a weapon and they boiled it down to like a DPS number on it. And it affected everyone the same. And like that's fine, but it just felt like it was missing something. Almost like your class didn't really matter in a way, other than
Mhm.
aesthetics, like if you were throwing toads or throwing lasers. Like, and that always kind of, I think I feel maybe more strongly about that than other people do, but like it's always stuck with me. Um, and so, and like Crystal Project has no magic attack stat, and like that's kind of how that ties in a way. I'm trying to do the same thing as that.
Right. It's
Um,
all based on mind, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
like physical attacks can be based on strength too. So like they both scale in that way, but most of the damage of magic spells comes from the spell itself. In general, usually mage weapons have more mind that they give, so that they do still scale. But you can
Mhm.
also get that from leveling up. So if you're kind of stuck, grinding on a mage will get you ahead faster than grinding on a physical class. And it's by design, just to make them feel different. It's neat. And so, yeah, and the way to. I like coming up with ways to restrict things to introduce this kind of personality to classes. And like, to go on another tangent, one way to come up with, okay, let's say you're trying to decide on new classes for your game. Something you can do to come up with ideas is make a graph where, like, along one axis you have the different kinds of roles, like physical DPS, magic DPS, AOE, healing, whatever. And on another axis you can have like uses MP, uses AP, weapon based, and so on. And then you can just kind of find intersections where you don't have something and be like, oh, that would be a really cool idea. Like an axe wielding, MP based physical AoE class. Cool. Like it's awesome.
That's a really cool
Mhm.
way to think about coming up with different ways to design a class uniquely, like with unique
Yeah.
perspectives. Yeah.
I was about to talk about how it's problematic though, so I feel
Oh.
kind of bad, but well, it's because like it's hard, at least for me, when you're doing that to come up with a bigger picture. Because you have like n classes, and so that's n times n possibilities. How do you track that all in your mind? And so, like, I still do that graph thing, but I also come up with rules that I have to follow, like how magic is typically uses MP, tens on the AoE side, whereas physical stuff doesn't use MP, tens on the single target side. Magic tends to have charge time. Like there are these restrictions. You limit basically certain intersections from this graph. And it's like, why is that a good thing? Because then when you're trying to make sure that all your classes fit together and are balanced, it it's hard to explain, but it really helps with that. Because let's say it was like a free for all, and you had a class that was a physical DPS that also happened to have high MP for no reason. It didn't use MP, and you're like, well, what subclass should I put on this? And it's like, well, the one that's physical DPS with the magic usage stuff, right? It like fits together like a square in the square hole, and it feels good. But if you don't have that class because of these restrictions you built in, now you have to come up with something kind of unique to match with it. Like maybe we'll use this class as high MP to supplement healing, because what else am I going to use it for? And then you can get threat by healing. Or you give them a weapon that has high DPS, but is also like boosting an element, so then you can sub them with mage stuff so that they have AoE to clear common fights with, because magic tends to be AoE. Otherwise, they wouldn't have AoE. It's just like neat, you come up with like cool solutions to like complete your build. And if you don't, like, you can still do that if you have the optimal thing. But then you'd kind of be nerfing yourself and it doesn't feel good. So if you just get rid of that so it's not in the game at all, it kind of invites a lot of creativity in a way when you're building out your characters. I think that's fun and really cool.
Do you find that it hovered over your head that, like, there are combinations that I probably didn't think of that could just completely break the experience?
It's definitely possible. And like, so like there are things in the game that are really balanced in a way where they're like kind of out of line. But one thing I did to try and like keep that to a like as low as possible was when I was building the game, speaking of tools, like in my data editor where I'm setting up all the values for the spells and stuff, I had it so that I could build a graph that like would simulate using every ability in the game against every monster using various types of equipment, and it would just like spit it out. And then you could go to that graph and sort it and see like what's the highest damage thing. And then that's how it can find outliers where like, oh, I missed that, like it's way better than the other stuff. And you could sort based on how much damage a spell would do per MP used, per AP used, per charge time, and like sort of work it out using these different metrics. And like I relied on that a lot as I was building the game. I made that probably like halfway through development, and every time I'd change numbers, I'd refer to the output from this tool.
It's literally the most bonkers thing I've ever heard of, like in a good way, to think that like you could create something that gives that much data. That I'm sure that is a dream tool, right?
Yeah, it gives a lot of like, it almost gives too much, and it's sort of has a lot of useless stuff in a way, but it is a dream tool for finding like the best things. Of course, it's and that's what you're kind of balancing around. Or you can like filter to what's the stuff that's likely to be used at this stage of the game, and like balance that too. And that's something else that something I do on purpose, is at different stages in the game, different things are OP, kind of by design. So like you do want to introduce those peaks and valleys there as you're playing through. Like that thing we mentioned earlier about making it so that classes are OP-ish when you find them. And that's something else I used this for to make sure that worked. Yeah.
What were some of those classes that you're like, this one, I love it so much?
I really liked Fencer. And
same.
It's an interesting... What do you think about... Do you think it's OP, underpowered, balanced? What do you think about
I think it's balanced personally. I think it falls off a little bit because I think stat dots kind of carry the first half of the game. And you basically, on one character, can control two of those. Plus, they're kind of an evasion whore, which I thought was really nice as well. But I didn't feel like they were OP because I felt like those strategies weren't holding up in the second half. But what about you, Soup?
I loved the Fencer. I agree with it. It was kind of weaker in the second half, but like being able to put dots on bosses was something I loved so much.
Being able to put status effects, period, the end
on bosses,
is just such a nice thing. Like, truly.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about Fencer is that according to this tool, it was way overpowered, and like still is. But I don't think it is. So there's something about feel also that it's missing that is important.
Was it the move that lets you like increase crit chance at a hit penalty? Because maybe it wasn't factoring in your chance to hit or something like that.
Well, that played into it, but it was just like the value it got from just using abilities that are free. One of the ways I nerfed it was I added the 6 AP thing. Originally, it had no cost on anything, and that was Fencer's flavor. And I thought that was
back
neat,
in.
where like if it didn't use any resources, you could kind of subclass anything and have that be fully available. But I was like,
Hmm.
these numbers are so high, I don't get it. What do I do? And then I added the AP cost just as a way to like justify it. But even then, I
Hmm.
think that was wrong to do. Um, and it came down to its passive where it just gets more crit damage. Like just the way the
Yeah.
numbers played out, it just kept like for what it spends to do damage, it was way above anything else.
Such a
Um,
fun class. Soup, what was one of your favorite classes in the game?
Obviously, the scholar.
Yeah.
I love going back to like old areas and hunting for spells that I might have missed, or just in general, like building off of like some of the buffs that you get from the scholar. Like being able to do more fire damage that early was super helpful.
It is a really fun class. I think potentially, if I had to say any class was more along the lines of like a broken class, that would probably be it, just because of the variety to control the field. Like you have a little
Hmm.
bit of everything, including that one where like what is it? You flip damage and healing, and you can just completely obliterate some enemies with that there too.
that
Yeah.
So
took a lot
fun.
of work to like make sure it was balanced. And it's so tempting to just remove it from the game, but I'm like, no, it's cool. It needs to be in here. And then it has
Hmm.
the thing where it heals based on your current HP. So one of the obvious combos at the beginning of development was like, oh, just use the reverse damage thing and then just use the heal for your current HP and you kill anything. It reminds me of Vanish X Zone or Vanish
Yeah.
Doom from FF3.
Which they took out in the Pixel remaster,
Yeah,
which is
that's probably for the best, but sad in a way.
that
I don't know how I feel about it.
in Tangier at the end of the World of Balance, that in the
Yep.
small island, like he's nearly impossible to the
You
point.
actually have to beat it now.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the only way I could beat him, because I just platinumed that on
Yeah.
stream, I had to beat him with limit breaks because it was the only way that I could
That's
do
funny.
enough damage on him. Like I think you can put him to sleep for a limited amount of time, or you could stop or something. And then I was just trying to proc limit breaks because they're the only things that could consistently do high
Yeah.
damage to him.
I've
So
never like deliberately used limit breaks in that game in my
not
life.
the game that you
That's
would think of. I felt
yeah.
like I was playing Final Fantasy VIII.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Um. Oh, good.
that actually something else that leads into something else I want to say about balance is that so another kind of side tangent is I used to play Dota and like way back in Warcraft 3 days, in the computer lab at university with all the other classmates or whatever. It was a new game dev lab, so like it had all games installed on it. They were still figuring out if that was a good idea to do or not, and we were like, "Oh, we'll play
It is
Dota
for
this in
us.
class."
Yeah.
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 And so the way that relates is Dota does something neat with balance where like it balances characters around like something overpowered or their biggest strength. Like you might
Hmm.
have a character that can one-shot stuff, and that's what it does. And then you introduce that into the game, people will be like, this character is broken. We have to nerf it. It's stupid to fight against. And the tempting thing to do, and I think a lot of companies do this, is you nerf it by just making it not one-shot anymore. But Dota's approach is like, well, let's further nerf its weaknesses so that counterplay's easier. Like you make it slower, less MP to be able to use the thing, higher cooldowns, whatever. And it's just really cool to do it that way because it keeps the fear and the personality of that mechanic in that character. And like if you don't fight against it properly, it will destroy you. But if you know its weaknesses, it's like nothing. And that's just really neat. And of course, it doesn't exactly translate to single player games, but I like to follow the same kind of balancing philosophy. And like that's one of the reasons I wanted that reverse polarity still in the game and was very stubborn about it.
I think that
And I
does
think it
make
went a
sense
bit.
too, right? Like you're
No, that's
thinking
super
of
cool.
the
Yeah.
rogue class, and that honestly is one of your highest DPS classes, but it's the big if of controlling how much aggro it has. So I see what you're saying. It's not like, well, we're gonna make the rogue weaker. It's like we're gonna like put that other limitation on it. It's like, yeah, but you need to find a way to manipulate its aggro. rate and where it is in terms of that, and that's what the rest of the party can do. So I think that's a great,
Exactly,
yeah,
100%. And like earlier on in the game, the rogue would be able to do damage if it wasn't uh
If it had
top
like zero
threat,
right.
aggro, yeah.
and now it needs to be bottom threat, which is like a lot harder.
And thematic, like with
Yeah,
how we
Yeah.
understand rogues and how Dungeons and Dragons has built them up. I think that makes complete
Mhm.
sense.
so you like add that mechanical limitation instead of just lowering the damage. It's like, yeah,
I will say, obviously, shout out to Warlock because Red Mage, and you did him so good. But I think
so good.
the class that I really really liked, and it's silly, but I thought the Nomad was so much fun. Having a pull from Avatar was cool, but I liked the idea, and I think this is kind of what you were talking about with that grid of like we have a magic based class that doesn't use magic points, and I love the way that it's done a little bit differently with the stances, where like some of it is what you set up with that AP is just so much fun. And even though I know it's not the most broken overpowered class, because I don't always think like I can just go in and one shot this. I think I only did that for the Coliseum because I'm just kind of like I'm struggling to get through this. But it was so much fun to do that, to have this class where you just get to see like how it fluidly interacts with a lot of different things.
Yeah, I'm glad you like that class because it's really um because the way you find it is very out. Like you have to kind of explore and find it accidentally. And because it's found like that, it can be weird. Like
I feel like
it's
my hint was you wouldn't have given the fish race if you wouldn't give us the opportunity to win it. So there must be more here. That was my philosophy, and that's how I found it.
and you're right. And that's a great like I think I came up with that accidentally after the fact because it was like why would I let someone find the race if they can't win? Like that's just frustrating. And then I'm like I have to add something else here instead of just like a come back later kind of hint, and putting the class there made sense in that context.
But classes like that, I feel like we don't see enough of in a lot of games, and I think it's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to games like Etrian Odyssey, where you have some of those like synergy-based classes where they might not be able to do anything on their turn. They take a little bit of setup, but when they're set up, they're cool. And I think that's cool. Like, you have some of these classes where, okay, I gave everybody, this would be an Etrian Odyssey example, ability to attack with fire on their weapons, but now I can remove that buff and do elemental damage to everything. And that's kind of how I felt about a couple of the classes in Crystal Project, and with the inclusion of the Nomad, where like, yeah, imminently this very second, is there something that could nuke a lot or a lot better? Sure, but this class plays the long game, and I think that's fun, where it's not just kind of like, bam, do big number.
Yeah, exactly.
I had a question about the samurai. Was that specifically inspired
that
by
class.
Final Fantasies 11?
Yeah. Like Final Fantasy 11 was my first MMO. And
Mm-hmm.
I think your first MMO is similar to your first RPG, where like it's the one you become most attached to at like an emotional level. And so I have a lot of inspiration from FF11's mechanics just because they bring back good memories and stuff. And so yeah, that's one of them for sure.
Yeah. Was there anything else that you would have stole from FF11 that you wanted in Crystal Project?
Probably the other biggest one is ninja dodge tanks. I think
That would be fun, yeah.
like having a tank role, I think can be made really neat by adding lots of different ways that you can tank.
Mhm.
And so having like the dodge tank is one of those. Having a cover tank is another. And like I've thought of more ways to do it since releasing the game that I wish I could have done, but like the dodge tank, that was another hard one to balance. Because what was difficult was how do you make it so that the ninja can dodge tank without just being able to take that class and sub it to something else and having those kind of be invincible?
Mm-hmm.
Because if Like, they use their evasion ability at the beginning of development. It is granted 100% evasion for X number of attacks. And yeah, they can use that to dodge thing, and that's great. But then just put that on your wizard, and now they're safe from everything. And that was the hardest part about that. I think it worked out in the end, somehow, almost accidentally, but I just really wanted to have dodge tanking in the game as like going back to that balancing around personality and OP stuff again. Like, I was very stubborn.
You have got to play Etrian Odyssey. I think you're gonna see a lot of the things that your game does, it just in a different vehicle if you give that series a shot, just because of the builds and even just thinking of like different ways that dodge tanking is done. Etrian Odyssey 5 has this one class, it's a fencer class, and it's a dodge tank, and for every attack it dodges, the next turn it can deal like this super amplified attack. So if you pulled all the attacks to your fencer and it dodges all those attacks, you're doing like a 9 times damage attack. It's just crazy stuff. We're nerding out right now.
That's fun.
But,
yeah,
definitely.
It's fun. I should have played that. It sounds like it has a lot of inspiration.
Truly, like they're great. Definitely different style of game, but also like Venn diagram overlapping as well. We're nearing the end of our conversation with you here, and we're having such a great time with you. So it's always unfortunate that when we get closer to this time. But I have something that I want to throw out there. I know earlier we said that we probably weren't going to dig into the theories because we didn't want to confirm or maybe spoil the mystery. But are there any secrets in the game that you're willing to share that you aren't completely sure if everyone's figured out, or may not have been as blatant?
No, I don't think there's anything left in the game from a seeing it or mechanics point of view that hasn't been found. And that reminds me of something I did by mistake that I'm still disappointed about. Is there's this item in the sea where if you talk to an octopus, it gives it to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this super annoying fast octopus. And it was meant to be not found, or you wouldn't realize it's there. You just see the octopus and be like, "What the heck is that?" And no one would care to catch it. But I made it so that in the item it gives you wasn't last in the archive, and so people were reporting that they found everything, but there was a missing entry. And is it a bug? What is that? And I had to I'm sad I did this, but I gave a hint that you had to find it from this thing. And I wish I just made it last so that I wonder if anyone would have found it or how long it would have taken.
Mm-hmm.
It's just oh well. But what's done is done. I think that was the biggest secret. I don't think anything else is really hidden in there.
Are there any bosses where you're like, man, a lot of people had struggled with this, but if only they just would have done this one thing, it would have been a moot point?
No, everyone's found the intended solution to stuff from in that context as well. And things that I didn't think about, which is great.
Yeah, a lot of people talking about fighting Gran super early, which I think I mentioned this in our book group, but I actually had to tell someone, hey, can you not post the directions about doing that? Because I don't want to.
Yeah.
You feel like you get so much experience and you get a pretty OP weapon from it that I didn't want them to skew everyone into thinking A, you had to do that, or B, you get something super beneficial from it.
That's a really good point. And that boss that goes back to how I was talking about keeping things fresh and different as you're playing. And it was important to put that early in the game because it's an area you get to and you're like, wow, this is weird. Oh, maybe it's a bit scary. And then you get jump scared and you die. And it's oh, this game can do that. And so it's kind of in the back of your mind now. But if you're paying attention to what it did and thinking about as shortly after Gran, you get the Scholar, and then you're like, oh, but there was this ability. You can puzzle it together and beat it trivially.
Mm-hmm.
And it's designed to allow you to realize that. But it won't tell you that because you don't have to do it. You can come back and beat it however you want. But it's just a reward that some people will find, and that's cool. The downside is some people will get hit by that and hate it, and it's it's a bit of a trade-off. You want to balance people having a fun experience that is special with like not wanting people to get frustrated, but sometimes that happens. Yeah, Gran was one of my favorite things is hearing about people's first run-in with it.
I mean,
Yeah.
it teaches so many different things too. Like, so sure, in some capacity, it teaches like I could find a way around this with the skills that I have. But even from a design standpoint, it also kind of teaches I have something to come back to. And I feel like
Yes.
there are a lot of bosses, and like I think that's just good design too. You're telling someone, don't be afraid to come back and tackle some of these challenges later, or there could be things to look for later, like the giant up on the mountain, and he has like the two things of, is it meat or they're like larvae or
Those
something?
little slug things.
Yeah, little slug things. Like I couldn't get past that really early on, so obviously I just like ran behind him and grabbed the thing that I needed. But then you talk to the one person and they're like, I need the thing that boss drops, but you can't, not everybody can handle that. So it's reminding you like, hey, mark this on your map, come back later and do it. It's fun to come back to these challenges at a later point and do them.
Yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, that's definitely something I think is great is when you're going through an area and you can't quite check everything off on it yet. And you have to go back and discover things. Well, not have to, like if you want to. And
Right.
yeah, I think that's neat. Some people like going through knowing that they've cleared it out so that they can kind of forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like another subjective thing that's a bit of a balance. I don't want to like... Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you like it anyway.
Yeah.
So after releasing the game on Switch and, you know, kind of feeling like it came to like a conclusion of like the Crystal Project cycle, what's next?
I am working on something new, a new project, and I haven't been for a long time, so this isn't an announcement for anything, of course, but like, it's like, I just want to say like I've missed working on a new game because there's like this state of mind you get into. I think I mentioned it once or twice in the earlier, where you're just constantly brainstorming balance and stuff and ideas, and like you have a notebook and you're writing it down, and like the further you get into a project, the more those ideas change from like coming up with new things to limiting it and trying to finish it. And like and at that point you sort of get tired of being in that mindset and like you want to get out of it. And by the time I finished Crystal Project, I was like ready to not always have to be thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And now I finally come to like miss that. And I have started working on something new, and I'm glad that I miss it and I'm getting back into it and having fun because I'm like, oh, I can come up with these ideas and like I'm writing it down, and it's just like a state of mind that I've really missed. It introduces creativity to like when you're doing mundane things like going on a road trip, a walk, riding the bus, whatever. It's like something to do with your mind, and it's really fun.
I'm sure it helps your sanity too, like letting your baby go, like unless something critically breaks in the game, you know, like it's never going to be, and I don't mean this in any negative way, like so perfect, you know what I mean? Like there's always going to be things.
Absolutely.
If you're super reflective, you're always going to be reworking it, but like at some point you just gotta like let it be and not over vacillate about it, and then just like move on to the next thing. And it's very exciting to hear that, because like obviously we're excited for the next thing too. So,
and of course it might not go anywhere, like it's still not like I don't even know if it'll be the same kind of game, but I don't know. It's fun. We'll see.
Racing game
somewhere.
It's going to be a racing game.
Yes.
Laguna Racing.
I really liked Diddy Kong Racing.
Same.
But it is also what you said about how you have to kind of let stuff go. And while I am starting to work on a new game, it's also kind of like an apology, like, oh, I won't be able to do as much work on new modding features or patches on Crystal Project. And like part of the thing that hurts about that is like if this game doesn't go anywhere, it's like, oh well, I made that sacrifice, what was the point of it? But I mean, you have to try, right? And yeah, it's exciting. And of course I'll still support Crystal Project forever, really. If there's like a bug that comes up, I want it to be bug free. And it will sit in the back of my mind until it's fixed, and like I will have this compulsion to fix it. So it will always be supported, of course.
That's just good
But yeah.
life. I think you're doing the right thing. I think it's just good life
Yeah.
practice too. Like, like you get the thrill of life again and the joy and, making another mark potentially, whether it lands or it doesn't. Like we're just creating that beautiful art for everybody to enjoy. But speaking of enjoying, I so much have enjoyed this conversation and you being here. This has been so incredible.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me. It was fun to just ramble on about like game balance creation stuff. It's
Well, I want to extend this to you as well. You are part of the RPGaymer family, so we would love to have you back, even if it's talking about someone else's game and the joy that you got out of it. So you were great on the episode. We'd love to have you.
That'd be a lot of fun.
Cool. Well, we're gonna sign off from here. So we just want to thank everybody from listening.
Yeah.
If you haven't played Crystal Project yet, it is on Switch and on Steam. Did you ever think of bringing it to PlayStation? Did we ask that, or is that just you're just like good with where it is?
I want it to be on PlayStation. There are things that make it hard to port there
Sure.
compared to Switch using the technology that I chose. I don't think I can get into specifics because of NDAs, but if it doesn't come out on PlayStation, it's not because I didn't try.
There are
I'll
reasons.
just say
Okay,
that.
okay. But
Fair.
Switch
Yep.
and on Steam, definitely check it out. Soup and I and a lot of our Discord members have loved it. Speaking of our Discord, if you want to be a part of any conversations, RP Gamer related, or if you just want to talk about any games in general, head on over to our Discord at Hey RP Gamer. We want to thank you all for listening. Now go out there and get gaming.